This Sunday on Rosemary Barton Live.
When we see things we've never seen before, we don't know exactly how they're all going to pan out.
Economic uncertainty. The closure of the Strait of Hormuz causes new threats and energy disruption, fueling concern of a global recession. RBC chief economist Francis Donald is here.
I do think a conversational style gave a chance for the leader to show kind of different sides of himself.
Repping Canada, Pierre Poilievre appears on one of the world's most popular podcasts, speaking out on Donald Trump and defending Canadian sovereignty. Conservative Party campaign manager Steve Outhouse joins us.
It is a house that belongs to the people of Canada.
Extreme home makeover. A government memo says Rideau Cottage is unfit to be the home of Canada's Prime Minister. Should 24 Sussex finally be renovated? I'll ask Ottawa Heritage President Catherine Spencer-Ross. It all starts now on Rosemary Barton Live. Thanks very much for joining us on this Sunday. I'm David Common. Rosie is away. Donald Trump says he will bomb Iran's power plants, a civilian target, unless the country reopens the Strait of Hormuz by Monday evening. This as the war enters its fourth week. Israel has again struck Tehran and has itself faced one of its worst nights of the war as Iran's missiles caused dozens of Israeli casualties. Whoa! Video from the town of Dimona shows one of Iran's missiles reaching its target in Israel. They also struck the nearby town of Arad, leaving more than 160 people injured. Iran now says if Trump targets their power plants, they'll target U.S.-linked energy sites across the Middle East and close the Strait of Hormuz completely. The war has sent oil prices surging, with Brent crude, the global benchmark, reaching as high as $112 on Friday. The average price at the pumps across this country up to well over $1.70 a liter. Diesel even higher at $2.19. Bank of Canada held interest rates steady in their decision this week, but warned the ongoing risk is already causing inflation, and it could get worse. I spoke with Francis Donald, the chief economist with RBC. Francis Donald, very good to see you.
Thanks for having me.
We are speaking after the International Energy Agency warned that if we continue on the same path, the Strait of Hormuz, all the attacks that are happening, that we could see this war lead to the greatest energy crisis in the world ever. What does that mean for the global economy?
Well, effectively, it depends who you are. Are you an energy exporter? Are you an energy importer? Or are you are you a country that's dealing with higher prices like Canada is, but gets some offset from higher revenues at home? Or are you a country that is straight up just going to lack access to energy? That's like Europe and Japan and many countries in Asia. And so effectively, the first thing that comes to mind when I hear about a shock of this magnitude is the divergences that it creates, not just within our own country, David, between provinces like Alberta and Ontario, but between the haves and the have-nots when it comes to energy. I have to tell you, though, we just went through the largest trade crisis we had ever seen. Now we're piling on another so-called supply shock. The difficult answer here is when we see things we've never seen before, we don't know exactly how they're all going to pan out.
How do businesses, be they in Canada or elsewhere, plan for any of this? There seems to be no predictability.
Yeah, that's a great question. And effectively, what we tend to say is focus on what we know to be true. We know the Canadian economy is relatively resilient. We know which sectors have a lot of upside potential, like in tech, and we know which ones are struggling under the weight of existing tariffs. We know the population is declining in Canada. We know that we have much more fiscal stimulus coming through. So in a world where there's lots you don't know, focus on what you do. And there are plenty of Canadian themes that will remain true throughout that. Unfortunately, we know that when gas prices rise, consumers, well, they have to allocate more money towards gasoline, and that means a little less money elsewhere, or it means they pull down on savings, or they have to use credit cards, or all of the above. So a little bit of consumer weakness here should be expected, but the magnitude of that and how long it lasts is still a question mark.
Also a question mark is what happens to inflation with the impact of the war. We saw it below that 2% marker before the war, and so the Bank of Canada holding interest rates where they were, where they are now. But where might things be heading if Canadian families, Canadian business have to spend more for the very same products?
Well, the simple calculation is that if we have oil around $100 per barrel, you'll see inflation rise above 3%. So that sub 2% slim comfort for what could be coming ahead. What's more challenging is what happens to fertilizer prices. What does that do for the costs of some foods across the entire world? And problematically, this isn't inflation that's easy for anybody to fix. A Bank of Canada could hike or cut rates as much as it wants. That's not going to solve the Strait of Hormuz. And so this is a central bank that is dealing with inflation dynamics that are largely out of their control. It's no surprise that they said, we're on hold right now. We need to see, does this permeate more deeply through the economy? Meanwhile, growth has been a little bit sluggish on the other side of the picture. We're growing around 1% in Canada. That's not a very clear picture for the Bank of Canada to react one way or the other.
And all of this coming is Canada losing 84,000 jobs just in February. The fact that we have kept the interest rates where they are in the wake of that, what should we take away?
Well, economists will always warn those numbers have a lot of variability. We've actually had a fairly resilient job market. The unemployment rate is lower than it was last year. But the most important thing to recognize here is that while it looks like we're losing jobs, people are also leaving Canada. We have population that's declining. And just like if you go to a party and you invite 10 people, you need 10 chairs. If you have people leaving your party, you don't need as many chairs. And that's the exact same thing for the job market here. This economy does not require the same amount of jobs that it did when population growth rates are around 3%. So we don't ever want to see lost jobs. Look towards the longer term trend, which is still okay. We're still seeing the unemployment rate decline, but we have to be mindful that this is not the same labor market that it was historically. There's demand for jobs, but then there's also supply of labor, and that's shrinking in Canada.
I want to underline that because it is, we learned this week, the first time ever since Confederation that Canada's population has shrunk. You speak to some people leaving the country. There are a number of other factors. Temporary foreign workers, far fewer of them as a result of the Carney government moves. Even birth rate, which has long been low in Canada, continues to either be low or in decline. What are we heading towards if this becomes more than a one-year event?
Well, also, let's not forget we have significant retirement activity. And while those folks aren't leaving Canada, they're being pulled out of the labor force. Well, the first thing an economist will tell you is there's only two ways to grow an economy. There's people working or more people working, and then there's how much stuff and how much activity each individual person makes. So if we have fewer people working in Canada, we're reliant on the same amount of people to do more to generate growth. And in what we call that low productivity environment, well, this is going to weigh on things like economists' GDP estimates going forward. So one of the reasons Canada is growing at a lowly 1%, and you could think about your business growing at 1% or your income rising at 1%, could be worse, but that's certainly no number to go home and call your mom over. That's largely driven right now by the fact that we are not adding people anymore. The flip side to that is not all growth is good growth that gets distributed to everybody. We saw good growth numbers in the past few years, but many would highlight that per capita growth, the amount of growth that went to each Canadian, was actually shrinking. Now we'll have a little bit less growth, but it'll be distributed amongst people a little bit more evenly, a little more growth per person coming through. So in the short term, this isn't necessarily a bad thing, but it plays a lot with the data that we're putting forward, and it means that we can't always do apples to apples comparison. Same thing with the labor market. We could lose up to 10,000 jobs per month, and the unemployment rate will stay the same. It's going to take a lot of change in the way we think about the jobs market. Population declines, never seen it before. Another one of those never seen before that changes the way that we have to think about the economy.
Finally, Frances, I want to ask you about private investment. Long been a challenge to attract private investment in this country. The Carney government has made it a priority, has done all these international trips trying to get more private investment in the country. How are they doing?
Well, foreign direct investment has actually been improving for 3 consecutive quarters. We're attracting money into Canada. That's, of course, the gold market, strong stock market, and a lot of interest in Canada having what the rest of the world is going to need over an extended period of time. So long-term investors looking at countries that have energy, particularly in this environment, water, access to the Arctic, relatively stable governments, foods and agriculture. Canada has that. And this current government has helped to sort of gone on a marketing campaign and awoken the world to it. But now there's a lag time between when we actually see those things come to fruition. And 2026 isn't going to be the year where we see these projects materially rise out of the soil. It's going to be a little bit longer. So now the challenge is going to be, how do we maintain that enthusiasm about Canada outside of Canada and inside Canada as we're going through a multitude of shocks, CUSMA reviews, oil crises, and we don't yet see some of that government money that is planned for, but not yet in the system. I think 2026 is a year where we're going to be challenging a little bit that narrative of how much can Canada change and how quickly.
RBC Chief Economist Frances Donald, always good to chat with you. Thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
President Trump has threatened to obliterate Iran's power plants if they do not open the Strait of Hormuz. I spoke with the former head of the Royal Canadian Navy about this, retired Vice Admiral Mark Norman.
It sounds emotional. It sounds punitive, and we heard this word before back in the summer as it related to the nuclear program, which apparently at the time was supposed to be obliterated. So I'm not a big fan. And the fact that they're targeting power infrastructure now just speaks to more, as I said earlier, punitive measures to try and apply leverage against the regime in Tehran. And unfortunately, this is just going to continue to make matters worse from my perspective. I think what they're trying to achieve here is capitulation, and I don't think that this regime is particularly interested in that outcome. And I think we're going to continue to see Iran doing the kind of things that they've been doing, attacking the Gulf states and continuing to, cause havoc in the straits. And I'm still concerned that we're going to see some potential terrorist attacks against softer targets in Western democracies.
We should note the Canadian government did say it was ready to help secure the Strait of Hormuz without specifying how. So we asked a government official to come on the program, but no one was made available. Coming up next, does the European Union want Canada as a member? There's certainly a push for closer ties. I'll speak with a German member of the European Parliament about Canada, the EU, and his report pushing for deeper cooperation. You're watching RBL. President Trump has lashed out at NATO over alliance members' refusal to get directly involved in the war or to intervene with their navies to get oil tankers moving through the Strait of Hormuz.
And then in the case of NATO, they don't want to help us defend the strait, and they're the ones that need it.
That's Trump Friday, calling NATO a paper tiger and cowards. 7 countries, though, Canada, Japan, the UK, France, Germany, Italy, and the Netherlands, have signaled their readiness to contribute to policing the strait once the conflict de-escalates. The Prime Minister has spent his first year in office trying to build closer ties with countries other than the U.S. And now a new report from the European Parliament is making the case to get tighter with Canada. It got overwhelming support and was authored by German member Tobias Kramer. He described an increasingly erratic American ally as one reason why the EU and Canada should strengthen ties. I spoke with him about his report. Tobias Kramer, thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me.
You are the author of this report looking at closer ties between the EU and Canada. Give me your case.
I mean, I think the case almost makes itself. We are in, as the Prime Minister put it, a moment of rupture in the international order. And Europe, our countries and Canada are facing the challenges very much the same. We are in a world of war-addicted Russia, an increasingly assertive China, and a somewhat erratic American ally. And we see very clearly that we are aligned with Canada, not just because of our common cultural heritage or the values we share when it comes to democracy, free trade, etc., but really also with the strategic challenges we have at the moment and our willingness to build a better international order, not just lamenting the rupture of the old one. In Europe, that is seen very clearly at the moment. And this is why I'm very happy that the report was also voted with 76%. That is pretty rare, 3/4 of a parliament at times of division. So it's in some ways Europe trying to, or at least the European Parliament trying to respond and say very clearly, we want to work with Canada. We see a lot of shared interest, and we want to actually put meat on the bones of the commitments that were made at the last summit when Prime Minister Carney was here in Brussels.
Well, let's talk about some of that meat. You talk about confronting security challenges, for instance. What are the specific things that we could do to help bring together some of these common areas of concern?
I mean, 2026 is pretty young as a year. It's only, 12 weeks old or something. And we've already seen so often that we were caught off guard, whether it be in Venezuela, whether it was with the annexation threats of Greenland in the Arctic, whether it is also with Ukraine, where we are still not really at the table, or now with Iran. I think here it's really in the interest of middle powers like many European countries, but also Canada, to work together and say we don't just want to be reactive, we want to be proactive, working together more closely. So when it comes to security and defense, on the one hand, we really would like to have a more formalized way of talking together, really like almost having it as a reflex that it's not just the Europeans and the Canadians giving statements one after the other, but having that together when something happens. But really also in the long run, when it comes to defense cooperation, Canada is the only non-European country participating, for instance, in the SAFE program. That is a way of European countries taking out money together to try to build capabilities together, because in this new world, we understand that it's good to have our values, but we need to match our values also with our capabilities. And Canada is the only non-European country being part of that. And I think that really shows the path that we have to go. We live in a world of increasing geopolitics where strength matters. And there, I think, is a win-win for both Canada and the EU to work together.
I'm going to pick up on something you said. We are the only non-European. And I bring that up because Finland's Alexander Stubb met with Mark Carney about a week ago. And he said, jokingly, maybe Canada should join the European Union. Well, we are non-European. Do you think there's actually any weight to that kind of an idea beyond a joke?
I mean, the nice thing about the European Union is that unlike other complexes, for us, it's really if a country wants to join, and then we look at that. I mean, I've seen that what almost half of the population of Canadians are interested in joining the European Union. It's in the end up to Canadians, but given a lot of the alignments we see, I'm somebody who thinks that given what has happened over the last couple of years, I won't exclude anything. So I like that as a long-term vision, but it ultimately is up to Canadians. But in the meanwhile, I think there are also already so many things we can do in the next couple of weeks and months ahead. To really cooperate already with the frameworks we have, and also to have steps in that direction. Maybe even with an association agreement as a first step. That is what I would really like to see. So I like the idea, but it also doesn't mean that we should just wait for that. We should also really do the steps that are already possible right now with the frameworks we have.
Yeah, and as I understand it, it's not super easy that some of the rules in the European Union have to change to allow something outside of continental Europe to actually become part of the EU. So it wouldn't be all that automatic. I do want to pick up on one thing, because I see a map of Ukraine in the background at your desk there. Clearly, this is an important topic for you. As we look at Ukraine's territorial integrity, we see the U.S. withdrawing much of its support for for Ukraine. What is the role of the EU in any of these on-again, off-again peace talks that have happened involving the Americans, the Ukrainians, and of course the Russians?
And you're absolutely right. I mean, I think Ukraine is perhaps for Europe right now the most important, most existential issue we face. We know that Vladimir Putin has invaded Ukraine not just for the sake of Ukraine or some territory in the Donbas. Putin has invaded because he's terrified of the European Union and the way we are living. He's terrified of functioning democracies in Europe and across the world, because they challenge the lies that his regime is built upon. So for us, this is really where also our liberty and the strength of our democracies is defended. And as I say, I was just there a couple of weeks ago and really seeing the resilience of Ukrainians there. I think it's absolutely essential that we as a European Union keep to our word and continue protecting and helping Ukraine in their heroic fight against the Russian invasion. But the problem is, you rightly say, like, we are at the moment not at the negotiating table. We are kept out of that. And I think part of that is that for too long in the European Union, we have thought that defense and security is somebody else's problem. We kept it out of European integration. We haven't actually built up the capabilities needed to stick to our values and ambitions. And that is something that is changing very rapidly right now. This is, for instance, part of why we have the SAFE program, where we are building up new programs, where we are trying to really create a common market of defense, and also why we are now working all the more closely with allies like Canada, but also Australia, Japan, South Korea, really trying to come together there, because in the end, this is not just about Ukraine, it's not even just about Europe, it's about whether we live in a world where it's just the survival of the fittest, the law of the jungle, or whether we actually have maintain an order where we say very clearly that this most important rule, that thou shalt not invade thy neighbor, must be protected, because nobody wants to be invaded by their big neighbor in this world, and that should be clear.
Tobias Kramer, thank you very much.
Thank you so much for having me.
Pierre Poilievre spent the week in the U.S. advocating for Canadian interests and making the case for tariff-free trade. His biggest audience on that trip was certainly a sit-down with one of the world's biggest podcasts with Joe Rogan.
I keep saying to the Prime Minister, steal my ideas.
Right. But he doesn't want to.
Well, I won't criticize him on foreign soil.
What's the strategy going on that podcast and the overall visit? Did the Conservatives see any potential risks? The Conservative Party campaign manager joining us shortly. Plus, the Sunday Scrum will weigh in. I'm David Common. You're watching Rosemary Barton Live. Pierre Poilievre is back in Canada after a week-long visit to the U.S., and the Conservative leader spent close to 3 hours on the Joe Rogan Experience, a podcast with an audience of more than 20 million.
We're very proudly Canadian, so we're never going to be the 51st state. And I just wish you'd knock that shit off so that we can get back to talking about the things that we can do as two separate countries that are actually friends. And the tariffs aren't a good idea either. We should get the tariffs out, because there's so much we could be doing together as neighbors and partners if we got rid of those tariffs.
The two covered everything from the trade war and the oil sands to the last election, even mixed martial arts. Poilievre spoke out against the 51st state talk for the first time on American soil. It's actually his first visit since he became party leader in 2022. So what was the calculus behind this trip? I asked the Conservative Party's campaign manager, Steve Outhouse. Steve Outhouse, good to have you here.
Hey, thanks, David. Thanks for having me.
Pierre Poilievre now back in the country. This was his first visit to the U.S. since becoming leader, since Trump has been president, since the tariff war began, everything around trade. Why was now the right time for Poilievre to visit?
First thing is parliamentary calendar. We've been working around that and figuring out when timing and schedules can work. But secondly, this is, continues to be an issue that's important to the Canadian people, and the leader wanted to, pitch into the Team Canada approach and make sure that we are, adding our voices to those who are advocating for strong trade between Canada and the U.S., tariff-free trade, protecting Canadian jobs, and showing how a strong trade relationship can affect both sides of the border. So,
is any part of it, Steve, that the Prime Minister gets to travel as the Prime Minister, has been traveling a lot as Prime Minister, and that you want to be able to position the Conservative leader as having the same kind of skill set?
Well, definitely. When I took this job, a lot of people in the media and a lot of people who would come and offer their thoughts and suggestions and so on have indicated quite clearly they want to see more sides of Pierre Poilievre. They want to see him not just in the House of Commons and being able to very effectively hold the government to account. They want to see him in leadership roles. And so certainly, yes, being a part of this shows maybe a side that people haven't seen before. And I'm sure we'll touch on it, but media interviews to the international community and so on are ways that he can share that message with a broader audience and show that what he can look like on the world stage as well. Absolutely.
Well, let's talk about the biggest interview, or at least the biggest audience in terms of interviews, and that is the Joe Rogan podcast. It is huge. No question about the potential benefit for Pierre Poilievre, but there's no question that Rogan comes with risk. He has embraced conspiracy theories in the past, and so I wonder, for you as the campaign manager, what goes into your calculus in deciding, the risk-benefit ratio there?
Yeah. Well, a few different things. First of all, I don't think you ever agree fully with everyone that you speak with, and certainly someone who's interviewing you. David, if you and I sat down and listed all of our beliefs and so on, we might not be, in agreement on everything as well. But we're looking at a couple different objectives there. First of all, the leader was speaking to an American audience to talk about, if we are working together, if these tariffs could be dropped, then this could affect things like the prices of trucks, and it can mean better jobs, and it can mean things being more affordable, because cost of living is important on both sides of the border. So that was sort of the first measure, is if we're looking to reach as many people as we can in the American market, for lack of a better phrase, then certainly the podcast with the largest audience, I believe, in the world, would be good to do that. And the secondary audience is absolutely domestic, and Mr. Rogan does have a large listenership here in Canada, and I do think a conversational style gave a chance for the leader for Pierre Poilievre to show kind of different sides of himself.
Steve, I want to ask you about polls. I'm not going to repeat what they say, but broadly that it would appear that Carney's Liberals are higher in the polls by 10, 11 points over the Conservatives. It comes at a time that we are not expecting an election, that the Liberals may end up picking up those 2 seats they need to get to a slim majority in by-elections. Maybe, we'll see. But what do you do in your job as campaign manager right now to not just ensure that you're ready, but be playing the long game in case it is 4 years until another election?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. So a few different things. I mean, polls are polls, and they do what polls do, and there are snapshots in time, and they go up and they go down. And definitely what you need to do if you're talking about long game is to not worry about them on the day-to-day basis. You know, we want to get out there every day. We want to chart the path that we believe is going to, first of all, talk about the issues that people care about. And, you know, if we're talking about polls, what we've seen, you know, is that affordability and cost of living is consistently at the top of the polls as to what shapes people's, their day-to-day lives and the things that matter the most to them. And so, you know, ultimately, yes, there are distractions and you know, other issues that come up on the daily that people will talk about. But if they're not able to feed their families or not able to find housing, those are things that are going to matter. And Pierre Poilievre and the Conservative team are focused on that. But look, I've led, now 3 different provincial campaigns, and in Alberta, now Premier Smith was behind in the polls when we started that campaign. Now Premier Wakeham was significantly underwater in whatever public polls were available in terms of preferred premier going into that. Led our opponents there actually to get quite complacent. And so, we just have to keep charting our course and talking to Canadians every day, talking about issues that matter to them, and that's the long game. And on the short term, as you've alluded to, the timing of the election will not be within our control, and so my job is in part to make sure that we're ready to go whenever that might happen.
Steve Outhouse, really appreciate your time. Thanks so much.
Thanks, David.
All right, let's unpack Pierre Poilievre's trip to the U.S. and the overall message of his appearance on Joe Rogan. We'll do that with our Sunday Scrum. Catherine Levesque, an Ottawa parliamentary reporter with the National Post, Ian Bailey, a reporter with the Globe and Mail, and Eric Grenier, polling analyst at The Writ. All 3 are in Ottawa this morning. Good day once again to all 3 of you.
How are you doing?
Hi, David.
Catherine, let me start with you. For any politician sitting down for nearly 3 hours, it's hard to stay on message track.
Absolutely. It's a good thing that he has a lot of history of, fitness and training and kettlebells because he filled a lot of that time with that. But yes, I think we really saw a new side of Pierre Poilievre, a very thoughtful side, someone who just knows a lot of facts. And but someone also who is solely focused on defending Canada, and he was bringing that to the world, well, to the American stage at least. And, Steve Outhouse said something that's interesting. I mean, this was also for a domestic audience. And, just last week I was on the road. I was sitting at Herb's, which is a diner in Eastern Ontario. And people at tables were talking about that Joe Rogan interview. So certainly this has been noticed. People, saw what Pierre Poilievre has done, and I think they really have a good impression of this interview. He stayed classy. He pushed back against conspiracy theories, not all of them, but most of them, and he didn't engage in petty politics against Mark Carney or even Justin Trudeau for that matter. So it was completely different from the apple chomping persona that we saw in the past. We really saw a new side of Pierre Poilievre, and I think that's a side that was there all along.
Ian, deciding to do Rogan, the upside is clear. You get an audience of 20 million. You get people talking about it at Herb's, for instance, but there is a potential risk in doing it. He's a guy who's embraced some conspiracy theories in the past. What do you think was the thinking going on among the Conservatives heading into that interview?
Well, obviously it's the massive audience for that podcast. It's the fact, I guess, the podcast sticks around. It's the fact that Canadians do watch this podcast. Obviously, the American audience are not going to be casting votes in the Canadian election, but Canadians do watch this show, and it's still there. And it's 2.5 hours. I listened to a lot of podcasts. 2.5 hours to me was a long run, but Mr. Poilievre had a sort of a massive stage on which to sort of present a new image, a kind of a more genial, less snarky kind of image. And frankly, he did that extremely well. The only way this could have been more of a win is if Joe Rogan had said, come back next month. Why don't we make this a regular thing? And if this had gone on. The challenge for Mr. Poilievre, the House is back tomorrow. He's back here. Can he keep this up? Can he be the Pierre Poilievre, he presented on the Rogan show in perpetuity, or at least until the next election. And that's going to be one of the challenges he faces. One other thing, by the way, it's good for Conservatives, I guess. The polls, I know Mr. Outhouse had a view on polls, but the polls are pretty grim for the Conservatives. By appearing on Rogan, doing well, it's clear from social media that Conservatives who may be uneasy about the state of the party have gotten something to be happy about, something to talk about in addition to voters, and that's also going to be helpful, I think, to Mr. Poilievre.
Eric, I'll get your thoughts.
I think it was a good podcast for Poilievre. It was, as you said, very long, and it did have a portion that I think would have lost a lot of the audience. But the thing is, it wasn't really that he was supposed to make gains among the people who would watch regularly the Joe Rogan show. They would largely, in Canada, be people who would already be open to Pierre Poilievre. But we've seen lots of coverage of this podcast. We're talking about it right now. And some of the headlines are pretty good headlines for Pierre Poilievre, that he stood up to Donald Trump on the 51st state stuff, that he was polite to Mark Carney when he had a chance not to be. So I think that that is actually probably the larger benefit that he's going to get from this podcast. Not so much the people who are going to get through the 2.5 podcasts. And if you're not a fan of MMA or kettlebells, it is a bit of a slog to listen to that back half of the podcast. But if all you are seeing are some of the clips that we've seen online, some of the coverage, then it's a pretty big win for Pierre Poilievre on a podcast that could have gone badly. We know that Joe Rogan can kind of meander. He has some views that could have got Pierre Poilievre in a bit of trouble, but instead he was able to kind of deflect and get to different conversations, different topics that were better for him than, to go too deep on COVID restrictions or things like that. So I think overall it was a good outing for Pierre Poilievre.
I do wonder if this is the first podcast involving a Canadian politician that spoke about kettlebells as often as it did. It certainly racked up quite a few, but I'll set that aside and look at the broader context here of the U.S. visit for a moment. Poilievre can't do what Carney can do. He can't travel the world looking for new partners and meet with heads of state as the Prime Minister can do. But Poilievre could go and meet some politicians in some places, though not Washington. What does that say, Ian?
Well, he didn't go to Washington, but he was with Joe Rogan. I mean, I know that Mr. Poilievre kind of indicated, I believe, that he didn't want to sort of double what Mr. Carney was doing. But he went on Joe Rogan, and Rogan clearly has ties to Donald Trump. He has ties to the, shall we say, the conservative side of the American political spectrum. And so in a way, Pierre Poilievre was able to speak to those people. And by doing well, he sort of delivered probably a helpful message. This may help, I think, Pierre Poilievre with the Americans in a way, with this move to become more of a statesman in ways that maybe today aren't entirely obvious, but that will pay off down the road. He's kind of engaged with them by going on Joe Rogan, I think, in a way that could be very productive.
Is the Pierre Poilievre that we have seen of the past couple of months, let's say post-leadership review, is that the Pierre Poilievre we should expect to see in the years to come? Catherine, I'll start with you.
That's a really good question. I think he's finally found his footing in the sense that, he now sees how he can play a role in this, tariff situation we have with the United States. He's done 2 international trips in the last 2 weeks. I don't know if he'll keep up that pace, especially that the Conservative Party is paying for it fully. But I think to Ian's point earlier, we'll have to see if he continues that tone this week in the House of Commons, which is really his favorite place to be. I think moving forward, it would be in his advantage, certainly, to be more thoughtful, more statesmanlike. And I think there are certainly efforts for him to do that. I would also encourage him to continue to give interviews, to various media outlets. Certainly he's done that here in Canada with Peter Mansbridge, with Paul Wells. And I thought those were really interesting interviews. And, he also had that same thoughtfulness. And, it was just, he's showing a new side of him that, again, was already there. We'll have to see. Things can happen. He can go back to his same, arguments and questions in the House of Commons. We'll see if that nice tone continues. But certainly, I think it's in his advantage to continue to stay thoughtful, to continue to advocate for Canada. I think that's a really good look for him.
And all of this is to position Poilievre and the Conservatives for whenever the next federal election is. Could be 3 years away. Eric Grenier, I'm going to get you to sort of pull back into your encyclopedia of political knowledge. Is there something comparable of a political leader who had a huge lead, lost an election, stuck around, and then 4 years later was able to become prime minister?
Well, maybe not that trail. I think that Pierre Poilievre has certainly, the fact that he had lost that 20-point lead, I think is largely unprecedented that you see something like that happen. But we've seen opposition leaders lose elections and eventually, become prime minister later on. So I don't think that is something that is out of his wheelhouse or that is impossible. But he does have big challenges because when you lose an election, there's usually a good reason for it. They don't just happen out of the blue. And I think that in this case, what has been really problematic for Pierre Poilievre is the contrast with Mark Carney. And I do think that is what he has been trying to address over the last little while, because Mark Carney is a bit of a globetrotter, and in the current context with global uncertainty, I think Canadians like to see the Prime Minister out and discussing things with allies. And for Pierre Poilievre, who had before had really not wanted to go abroad, who wanted to be a bit of an attack dog in the House of Commons domestically here in Canada, that contrast no longer really worked for him. It worked well with Justin Trudeau, but it doesn't work with Mark Carney. So I think the fact that we've seen him in these settings where he looks serious, he's trying to present himself as a future prime minister, I think that's really what they're trying to address, is that the opposition leader, that he was very good at being an opposition leader, when you are an opposition leader and you're good at it, voters tend to keep you in that job. So I think he's trying to change the perception because you don't want to be an opposition leader forever.
All very curious. We'll have to leave it there. Thank you very much to the three of you.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Well, for years, there's been plenty of talk, but no actual action on needed repairs for the Prime Minister's official residence.
Quite a difficult architectural problem, and it might have been more practical to tear it all down and begin again.
CBC News has learned a decision on 24 Sussex is looming with some potential options, including renovations or relocations. It's been more than a decade since the Prime Minister actually lived there. Some in Ottawa want that to change. I'll speak with one coming right up here on Rosemary Barton Live.
The address is 24 Sussex Street, Ottawa. Perched primly on 5 meticulous acres,
24 Sussex has been the official residence of the Prime Minister since the 1940s. It's played host to the Queen and been the site of countless key political encounters. But the historic home is unlivable now. No Prime Minister has been there, living at least, since 2015, not with mold, rats, and asbestos. Renovations have been needed for decades, but no PM has wanted to be seen spending money on the official residence. CBC News has learned a decision on 24 Sussex is now looming, after recent internal memos showed the PM's current residence is inadequate in the eyes of the RCMP. Now, various groups want something done, including Heritage Ottawa. I spoke with that organization's president. Catherine Spencer-Ross, good day to you.
Good morning.
CBC News understands there are essentially 3 options here. So either a major renovation of the existing complex at 24 Sussex or upgrades to Rideau Cottage, where prime ministers have lived for basically the past decade, or a completely third option, a move to a new house and a new complex. What would you prefer?
Oh, I'd prefer that 24 Sussex was retained as the Prime Minister's residence. There are lots of options that can be done on the site. The house can be restored, and if necessary, if you need more space, put on a sympathetic addition or a completely separate building on the site that complements the existing building.
One of the challenges from a security perspective is the site itself, that it's on a cliff, it overlooks a river, they can't go backwards into the backyard, and they can't go forwards either because there's a street, a quite well-used street out front. That security is a challenge. Do you see a way to overcome that?
I am no security expert. I'm sure that with modern technology, there are ways of doing it. And I would argue perhaps that the cliff is actually really good security because it means that the site is less accessible on almost 3 sides.
You have actually gone as far as to write to the Prime Minister about this. What is your case?
My case is that there is a vacant house sitting on a piece of property in downtown Ottawa. It is a house that belongs to the people of Canada, does not belong to the sitting Prime Minister, it does not belong to the government party in power. It is for all Canadians, and I think it is our responsibility to ensure that that house is suitable for the Prime Minister and that he or she has a really good place to live that is representative of Canada. And I think it's the responsibility of government to make sure that this building is kept up to snuff.
The Americans have the White House, the Brits have 10 Downing, the French have the Élysée Palace. What do you think it is about Canada that no Prime Minister, no government has felt that there is the public support to go and spend big money renovating 24 Sussex?
I think it's very Canadian. I think it's really an embarrassment because we don't need an Élysée Palace and we certainly don't need a White House. The Australians and the New Zealanders manage with smaller houses. I think the important thing is that there is a house designated for the sitting Prime Minister.
Why do you think that house should be in public use, that particular house?
Well, it's a classified federal heritage building for a reason. The building was built at the time of Confederation. It was occupied by 3 lumber barons who all, incidentally, became members of Parliament. It's been the residence of the Prime Minister since the early 50s with Louis Saint-Laurent. So all Prime Ministers have lived there since then, except for Kim Campbell. And then, of course, Justin Trudeau and Mark Carney. It is situated in an iconic spot. Its neighbors are Rideau Hall, which was built about 30 years before, and the French Embassy, which was built just before the Second World War. It's on the ceremonial route to Parliament Hill. It's in the same style. It's a classical version of Gothic Revival because it's gone through various evolutions. It's got similar buildings in Earnscliffe, further along the road. That's the British High Commission. And the road leads to Parliament Hill, which is also Gothic Revival.
Last question to you, and this is a personal curiosity. How did 24 Sussex actually become the residence of the Prime Minister?
I don't know the deep down story, but it was, as far as I understand, it was the last private owned house on the street, which was rapidly becoming a place for embassies and government buildings. And of course, it's right by Rideau Hall, which is a large swath of property with a big house on it. And I think it was an opportunity to take over a building that would put the Prime Minister in a special place. The landscape is gorgeous. The street is important. The house is was renovated to suit the Prime Minister, and I think it wouldn't be a question if the house should stay there if successive Prime Ministers had ensured that the place was kept up over time.
Catherine Spencer-Ross, thank you very much.
Thank you.
And that is a wrap for this program this week. Rosemary Barton will be back next week, and I will be back on tomorrow morning on CBC Morning Live. Of course, all your latest headlines on CBCNews.ca and CBC News Network. Thanks very much for checking in with us.